The wind rolled low across the parched hills, brushing past brittle grass and sun-bleached fence posts like a tired exhale. Thomas Kane stood motionless on the ridge above his crumbling cabin, a shovel planted in the dirt beside him. Before him lay a shallow grave half dug, half abandoned, its edges jagged, like the thoughts in his head. He didn't rush to finish it. There was no one to hurry for, no witnesses to his final act. Just the land, the wind, and the silence. At 73, Kane had outlived everything that ever gave him reason. His wife had died a decade prior from the fever that tore through the valley like wildfire. Their only child, a boy named Luke, had perished 2 years later during a cattle drive gone wrong, trampled beneath hooves in Wyoming territory. Kane had buried them both beneath cottonwoods out back, carved their names with the same knife he'd carried through the war, and stopped speaking much after that. Now, even the animals were gone. His last horse, an old buckskin named Romer, had collapsed by the fence 2 weeks earlier, never to rise again. Kane had buried him with trembling hands and a splitting back. After that, there was nothing left to do but wait. The cabin sagged with age, its roof bowing under the weight of every storm it had weathered. Inside, dust claimed every surface, and the fireplace hadn't been lit in days. The fields that once yielded corn and wheat now lay fallow, more dust than soil. The barn door swung on one hinge, groaning like a man too proud to beg for help. It was, Kane believed, a fitting place to die. Forgotten, unnoticed, he had no plans to shoot himself. That wasn't the kind of end he wanted. Instead, he dug his own grave, a slow, grueling act of preparation, and told himself that when it was deep enough, he'd lay down beside it and let the cold take him when the time came. Maybe it would be the rain. Maybe sleep. Maybe something hungrier. He cooked what he believed would be his final meal that morning: beans, jerky, and black coffee boiled so long it tasted like burnt soil. He didn't dress up for death, just wore what he always did: faded jeans, a threadbare flannel shirt, and boots that had seen more ground than most men ever would. His rifle leaned against the porch rail, oiled and loaded not for use, but as a kind of ritual. One last piece of order in a life that had fallen apart, as dusk drew its long shadows across the prairie. Kane settled into the rocking chair on his porch, the same place he'd once bounced his son on his knee, the same place he'd held his wife's trembling hand while she coughed blood into a kerchief. Now, there was no laughter, no coughing, just the creak of the chair and the low howl of the coming storm. In the distance, thunder cracked faintly, like the sky was groaning open. Kane narrowed his eyes toward the western horizon, watching the dark clouds roll like smoke over the hills. He liked storms. Always had. They reminded him that the land was still alive even if he no longer felt part of it, but something different rode in with this storm, a feeling, a tension in the air that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. Not fear, he was too tired for that, but a sense that he was no longer the only soul on that lonely stretch of earth. And then he heard it, faint at first, metal clinking against stone, not the natural rhythm of horse tack or a ranch tool. Something more desperate, smaller, a chain, perhaps, or shackles. Kane straightened, one hand resting on the rifle. The sound drew closer. Through the mist of the coming rain, through the scent of wet dirt and old ghosts, something moved, something human. He squinted into the dark, and that was when he saw her. She stepped from the dusk like a memory that hadn't yet decided whether it was a dream or a ghost. The rain had not yet broken, but the sky hung low, swollen with storm, casting everything in a strange bluish gloom. Thomas Kane's hand hovered near his rifle, not out of fear, but instinctors of solitude on the range didn't teach a man to be gentle with surprises. And this was no ordinary surprise. She looked to be no more than 12 or 13, a slip of a girl, so thin her ribs pressed against the wet fabric of her torn dress. Mud clung to her bare feet and calves like it was trying to hold her back. Her hair was matted, plastered to her cheeks by sweat, rain, or tears, he couldn't tell. But it wasn't her face or her frame that rooted Kane to the porch. It was the sound he'd heard just before she appeared. A rattling, soft, metallic, unnatural, out here in the wild. Now he saw why. Her wrists were shackled. Heavy, rusted irons bound them together, the kind he hadn't seen since before the war. A length of broken chain dragged behind her, snagging on roots and rocks as she walked. Each step was effort, each breath visible. She didn't run or cry or call out, she just walked. Straight toward him, like she knew exactly where to go, even if she didn't understand why. Kane's first thought wasn't suspicion, it was fury. Not at the girl, but at whoever had done this to her. Those chains didn't belong to a prisoner. Not one properly tried and sentenced. They belonged to someone enslaved, someone owned, and in Kane's long, bitter life, he'd thought that part of the world had long since died. "Stop right there," he said gruffly, but not with menace. He was testing her reaction, looking for signs of danger, deception, something. But the girl didn't flinch. She looked up at him with eyes so hollow they might have been carved from the prairie sky itself. There was no fear in them, but neither was there trust, only exhaustion and hunger. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse. like she hadn't spoken in days. "I need help." Kane stared at her. For a moment, his mind raced backward, through all the times he'd passed beggars in town, all the times he'd told himself he was too tired, too old, too empty to take on someone else's burden. But something about this girl struck a chord he thought had long since been broken. Without answering, he stepped off the porch and walked toward her. She didn't retreat. She just stood there, swaying slightly, like she wasn't sure if she was still alive or dreaming. Up close, he could see the bruises ringing her wrists beneath the rusted cuffs. The chain links were jagged, and one had bitten into her ankle. Her dress was torn near the shoulder, and the dirt smeared across her skin didn't hide the fading bruises. He took a slow breath and motioned toward the porch. "Come on inside," he said. "You look half frozen." The girl blinked at him, unsure, but followed. She limped slightly, dragging the chain behind her like a ghost she hadn't yet shaken. When she reached the porch, she hesitated at the steps, as if expecting to be yanked back. But nothing stopped her. No voice shouted, no hand grabbed her. Kane opened the cabin door and stepped aside. She crossed the threshold, like someone stepping into heaven. Inside, the place was dark and smelled of dust and coffee and old leather. Kane lit a kerosene lamp, the soft glow revealing just how gaunt the girl really was. She collapsed onto the worn wooden bench near the fire pit without waiting for invitation. Her hands trembled. Her lips were chapped. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in everything and trusting nothing. Kane knelt by the fire and began to stir it back to life. He didn't speak, didn't ask her where she came from or how long she'd been walking. He just moved with slow, practiced patience, feeding the flames, setting a pot of water to warm, and slicing bread and cured meat onto a plate. She watched him like an animal, unsure if the man with the food would also carry a whip. When he placed the plate and cup in front of her, she didn't thank him, just stared, wide-eyed, as if unsure. It was real. Kane sat down across from her. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He just said, "Eat." She stepped from the dusk like a memory that hadn't yet decided whether it was a dream or a ghost. The rain had not yet broken, but the sky hung low, swollen with storm, casting everything in a strange bluish gloom. Thomas Kane's hand hovered near his rifle, not out of fear, but instinct. Years of solitude on the range didn't teach a man to be gentle with surprises. And this was no ordinary surprise. She looked to be no more than 12 or 13, a slip of a girl, so thin her ribs pressed against the wet fabric of her torn dress. Mud clung to her bare feet and calves like it was trying to hold her back. Her hair was matted, plastered to her cheeks by sweat, rain, or tears. He couldn't tell. But it wasn't her face or her frame that rooted Kane to the porch. It was the sound he'd heard just before she appeared. A rattling, soft, metallic, unnatural, out here in the wild. Now he saw why. Her wrists were shackled, heavy. Rusted irons bound them together, the kind he hadn't seen since before the war. A length of broken chain dragged behind her, snagging on roots and rocks as she walked. Each step was effort, each breath visible. She didn't run or cry or call out. She just walked, straight toward him, like she knew exactly where to go, even if she didn't understand why. Kane's first thought wasn't suspicion, it was fury. Not at the girl, but at whoever had done this to her. Those chains didn't belong to a prisoner, not one properly tried and sentenced. They belonged to someone enslaved, someone owned. And in Kane's long, bitter life, he'd thought that part of the world had long since died. "Stop right there," he said gruffly, but not with menace. He was testing her reaction, looking for signs of danger, deception, something. But the girl didn't flinch. She looked up at him with eyes so hollow they might have been carved from the prairie sky itself. There was no fear in them, but neither was there trust. Only exhaustion and hunger. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in days. "I need help." Kane stared at her. For a moment, his mind raced backward, through all the times he'd passed beggars in town. All the times he'd told himself he was too tired, too old, too empty to take on someone else's burden. But something about this girl struck a chord he thought had long since been broken. Without answering, he stepped off the porch and walked toward her. She didn't retreat. She just stood there, swaying slightly, like she wasn't sure if she was still alive or dreaming. Up close, he could see the bruises ringing her wrists beneath the rusted cuffs. The chain links were jagged, and one had bitten into her ankle. Her dress was torn near the shoulder, and the dirt smeared across her skin didn't hide the fading bruises. He took a slow breath and motioned toward the porch. "Come on inside," he said. "You look half frozen." The girl blinked at him, unsure, but followed. She limped slightly, dragging the chain behind her like a ghost she hadn't yet shaken. When she reached the porch, she hesitated at the steps, as if expecting to be yanked back, but nothing stopped her. No voice shouted. No hand grabbed her. Kane opened the cabin door and stepped aside. She crossed the threshold, like someone stepping into heaven. Inside, the place was dark and smelled of dust and coffee and old leather. Kane lit a kerosene lamp, the soft glow revealing just how gaunt the girl really was. She collapsed onto the worn wooden bench near the fire pit without waiting for invitation. Her hands trembled. Her lips were chapped. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in everything and trusting nothing. Cain knelt by the fire and began to stir it back to life. He didn't speak, didn't ask her where she came from or how long she'd been walking. He just moved with slow, practiced patience, feeding the flames, setting a pot of water to warm, and slicing bread and cured meat onto a plate. She watched him like an animal, unsure if the man with the food would also carry a whip. When he placed the plate and cup in front of her, she didn't thank him, just stared, wide-eyed, as if unsure. It was real. Cain sat down across from her. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He just said, "Eat." It was nearly a month since Clara had appeared on his land, and though Cain said little and asked even less, he found himself rearranging his routines around her presence. Where once he had moved through each day like a ghost, waking, eating, tending to the few chores that still mattered, now there was a new rhythm in the cabin. The girl had become part of the place, like the creak in the stairs or the wind that whispered through the eaves. She didn't chatter, didn't demand, but something in her quiet steadiness seemed to pull him from the edges of himself. They often sat by the fire after supper, each in silence, staring at the flames. Clara would curl up on the rug, with her legs tucked beneath her, the shackles still clinking softly whenever she shifted. Cain stayed in his old chair, the one he'd carved by hand after the war, arms resting on his knees, boots warm, near the hearth. He'd lost track of how many nights they'd done that now shared nothing but the fire and the silence. But one night, when the wind was especially restless and the clouds hung low, like a ceiling about to crack, Clara broke that silence in a way that made him freeze. "Why do you live out here alone?" The question wasn't aggressive, just curious. But for a man like Cain, it felt like someone had turned the doorknob on a room he hadn't entered in years. He took a breath, slow and gravelly. "Didn't plan it that way," he muttered. "Had a family once, wife, boy, but the land took one, and the road took the other." Clara didn't look at him, just nodded faintly. "Do you miss them?" Cain hesitated. "Every damn day." The fire cracked sharply. She rubbed her hands together, not from cold, but nervousness. "You're not mean," she said suddenly, almost accusingly. "Not like I thought old men like you'd be." Cain snorted softly, surprised by the honesty. "Suppose I got tired of being mean." She looked up, meeting his eyes across the firelight. "You were," he nodded, "a long time ago. After the war, I didn't trust nobody. Not even myself. Spent years angry at the world. At what I lost. At what I couldn't fix." Clara blinked slowly. "But now," Cain shifted in his chair, voice low, "now I just want peace. That's all. Thought I'd die out here and be done with it. Had even dug the hole for it." That made her sit upright. "You dug your own grave." He didn't answer with words. Just gave her a slow look, the kind that said yes. "And what of it?" Clara's brow furrowed, her lips pressing together tightly. She looked away, then back, and then, in a voice so soft it barely reached him, she said, "I don't want you to die." The words caught in the air like a bird hitting glass. Cain stared at her, the old ache in his chest stirring in ways it hadn't in years. He didn't know what to say, so he just watched her, this strange, broken, resilient child, until she whispered again, "I don't got nobody left. Not really. I was just passed from one man to the next. I don't even know where my mama is, or if she's alive." Cain's throat tightened. Then she said it. Not loud, not dramatic, just simple. Raw. "Would you be my father?" It was a question, but it wasn't. It was a wish. A last-ditch offering from a girl who'd known nothing but chains and doors and silence. Cain didn't speak for a long time. The fire popped and hissed. The wind moaned against the shutters, and the night leaned in to listen. At last he reached out slow, careful, and placed his weathered, calloused hand over her small, shackled ones. "I'll try," he said. And the girl, for the first time since she'd arrived, smiled through her tears. The next morning dawned with a hush. The sky stretched open in soft pastels, pink and orange bleeding across the horizon like a breath after too many held nights. Cain rose earlier than usual, not because of habit, but because sleep had been pushed aside by the weight of a sentence Clara had whispered by the fire. "Would you be my father?" He hadn't known what it would stir in him, but now, standing at the edge of the porch with the wind tousling his gray hair, he realized the hollowness that had haunted him for years had shifted, not filled, not erased, but moved, like it had made space for something new. Inside, Clara still slept upstairs, curled under the thick quilt he'd once folded away for good. He didn't wake her. She hadn't had a peaceful night's sleep in weeks, maybe longer. Her breath was steady now, and there were no murmured cries in the dark like the first nights she'd arrived. The sound of her resting, of being sick, only for a while, was sacred. Cain let her have it. He saddled the old mule and rode to the southern pasture to mend a stretch of fence that coyotes had chewed through. But even as he hammered boards and tested wire, his mind wandered to Clara, to the thinness of her arms, the resilience in her quiet, the way she had never really cried, not until she smiled. He'd spent years building a life with silence. only to discover that hers somehow spoke louder than any voice he'd known by the time he returned to the cabin. Clara was outside, sitting cross-legged near the chicken coop, watching the hens peck at the dirt. Her hair was brushed tried to be. A crooked parting ran through the middle, and it was tied back with a faded strip of red cloth she must have found in the bottom drawer near the wash basin. "You feed him already?" he asked. "Dismounting. She nodded and watered the goats. Cain raised an eyebrow. "Well, I guess I'm the one who's late." Then Clara smiled a little, but it was different now, warmer, less guarded. "I figured a daughter ought to do her chores," she said. The words hung in the air, sweet and unsure. A test. Would he flinch at the word? He didn't. "Reckon you're right," he replied, lifting the feed sack from the saddle and carrying it toward the shed. "But a daughter's gotta eat, too." Clara followed him inside. He fried eggs in the skillet, sliced bread, and cut an apple into slivers. She watched everything he did, the way children do when they're not just hungry for food, but for ritual, learning how home works, how routine becomes love. After breakfast, Cain rummaged through a small wooden box tucked beneath the stairs. From it, he pulled a rusted iron file, a small hacksaw, and a bottle of lamp oil. Clara watched quietly as he knelt beside her and took her shackled wrists into his calloused hands. "You sure?" he asked. She bit her lip, then nodded. "I think it's time." He set to work gently, carefully. It took time. The metal had rusted deep, and he was determined not to scrape her skin. Clara didn't wince. She just stared at his hands, watching the way he worked, steady, patient, focused. When the last chain clinked to the floor beside them, she didn't cheer or cry. She simply held her bare wrists in her lap, as if she was meeting her own skin. For the first time in years, Cain picked up the links and dropped them into the fireplace. The flames caught them slowly, licking at the rust until the metal hissed and darkened. They didn't burn, but they would never go back on her again. After that, something changed. Clara began to hum when she swept the porch. She asked about the names of trees, about why the mule limped on cold mornings. She began to laugh, a soft sound at first, then louder, like the land itself was learning a new kind of echo. And Cain, old and tired, and wrapped in his own ghosts, began to laugh too. They weren't healed. Not yet, but for the first time in years, they were living. Summer came gently to the range that year, as if nature itself recognized the fragile rebuilding of two souls within that cabin. The storms passed softer, the rains soaked deeper, and the winds carried a kind of hush that felt more like protection than threat. Cain, whose days had once been empty markers between sunrise and sleep, now found each hour claimed first by chores, then by small questions, and finally by the warm sound of a child's presence stitching itself into his routine like a song. Remembered, Clara had started asking more questions. Not about the world, but about him. She wanted to know what kind of boy he'd been, if he'd ever been afraid, if he'd ever cried in front of anyone. Cain answered as best he could, told her about the war, about the day his wife had died giving birth to a son who lived just long enough to squeeze his finger. He told her he'd spent 20 years asking God why that boy got buried instead of him. Clara listened to every word, sometimes nodding, sometimes crying silently beside him. Then, one night, she said, "Maybe you didn't die because I was still supposed to find you." Cain didn't speak after that. He just reached over, pulled the blanket over her shoulder, and sat beside her by the hearth until she fell asleep, wondering if the God he'd cursed for so long had finally decided to answer without speaking. But not every whisper on the wind brought comfort. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch watching the sun slip behind the hills, Cain noticed something strange on the trail far beyond the fence line. A speck of movement to riders, slow and deliberate, not local. Clara saw them too, and her entire body tensed like a deer catching scent of wolves. Her hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair, and her breath caught hard in her throat. "You know Em?" Cain asked, his voice low. She didn't answer right away, then she nodded. "Barely. The man on the left. I think he owned me." Cain's jaw locked tight. He stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to the barn. Clara followed him, pale and shaking, unsure of what he was about to do. He opened a chest, wrapped in canvas, and pulled out a rifle he hadn't touched in years. Clara stared at it not with hope, but dread. "I don't want you to get hurt," she said quickly. "They don't care if you're old or kind. They'll burn everything just to take what they think is theirs." Cain looked at her, eyes narrowed, not with fear, but clarity. "You're not theirs," he said. "Not now, not ever." He oiled the rifle quietly as dusk settled. Clara sat nearby, arms wrapped tight around herself, the ghost of the chain still echoing in her bones. She wasn't afraid of the men, she was afraid of being dragged back into the dark, of losing the one place she'd been treated like more than property. As night fell, Cain lit a lantern and placed it on the windowsill, then sat with the rifle across his lap. Clara brought him coffee, her hands shaking. She didn't sleep that night, nor did he. They sat side by side, hearts beating in the same rhythm, waiting for dawn or danger to break the silence. Whatever came, Cain knew one thing now. He hadn't dug that grave for himself. he'd dug it for the man he used to be. And by morning, if fate allowed, he'd bury that man for good. Dawn came slowly that morning, reluctant and heavy like it, too, feared what might come. A dull orange glow began to bleed across the edge of the horizon, brushing against the tops of the hills and catching on the dew that clung to the tall grass, like sweat on a waiting brow. Kane hadn't moved all night. His hand stayed firm on the rifle resting across his lap, his eyes never once leaving the trail. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, curled against the wall, eyes swollen from lack of sleep but wide open, her every muscle pulled taut beneath the skin. Then, just as the first sliver of sun broke fully over the range, they saw the dust rise again. Two riders, just as before, but this time they weren't far off. They were at the fence line now. Kane stood. Clara did too, though her knees buckled slightly before she caught herself. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. The fear in her eyes spoke louder than any plea. The riders didn't knock. They reined in at the front gate like they owned it, boots still in stirrups, eyes cold. One was middle-aged, smug, chewing a sprig of grass like it was his personal toothpick. The other, a younger, wiry man with dead eyes, wore a long black coat and had a pistol dangling from his belt like a warning. Kane stepped out onto the porch slowly, holding the rifle openly, not threatening, just present. The older rider tipped his hat. "Mornin', mighty fine land you've got." Kane didn't answer. "We're looking for someone," the man went on, his voice dripping false charm. "Young girl, about this high, was stolen from a good man's home. We think she might have wandered this way." "She wasn't stolen," Kane said flatly. "She escaped." The younger man chuckled. "Well now, ain't that cute? The old fella thinks he's a hero." Kane's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise the rifle. "She's free now." The man in the coat dismounted. Clara shrank back inside the doorway. Kane took a single step forward, and this time he did raise the rifle slightly, just enough to be understood. "That's close enough." The older man frowned. "Now listen here, Grandpa, you don't know what you're messing with. That girl was bought legally, she's property." Kane's voice turned to gravel. "No one's property on my land." The tension snapped into the air, like a whip. The younger man's hand slid toward his pistol, but before it could settle, Kane's rifle shifted, and for a moment no one breathed. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, trembling. "Let her go," the older man said slowly. "You do that, and we ride off. No trouble." Kane shook his head. "There's only one way you leave Heron, that's without her." Silence. The younger man took a step forward. That was all Kane needed. The hammer on his rifle clicked back with finality, and in that sound was a message clearer than any shouted threat. "Try it, and you won't leave walking." The two riders looked at him, at the quiet fire behind his tired eyes, and then at the girl behind him who now clutched the wooden frame of the door like it was the only thing keeping her standing. The older man cursed, under his breath, spit, then yanked the reins. "She ain't worth the bullet," he muttered. "Come on." The two men turned. Dust kicked up as their horses trotted away, slower than before, as if something in them had been unsettled not by force, but by conviction, the kind of conviction that couldn't be bought or threatened. Kane didn't lower the rifle until the riders were 2 hills away. Only then did Clara step fully outside, her face pale, her hands shaking. "You think they'll come back?" she asked softly. Kane stared into the horizon. "They might," he said. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something fierce, something fatherly. "But next time," he added, "they'll find a family waiting." Weeks passed, and though the dust on the trail never rose again, Kane watched it every morning just the same. It became part of his routine, like feeding the chickens or checking the fences. He didn't wait in fear, he waited in protection, the way fathers have always done, whether they were young and strong or old and worn. And Clara, free from her chains and fears for the first time in memory, began to grow, not just taller, but fuller, brighter, as if the girl, who once whispered, in shackles, was blooming with every sunrise. She took to the land like she'd always belonged. Her hands hardened, her arms grew strong. She mended fences with him, learned to ride, milked the goats without asking, and by the end of the month, she knew every chicken by name. Kane caught her humming when she thought no one was listening, old lullabies that he didn't recognize. Tunes perhaps buried deep in her past, resurrected now, in peace. But it wasn't just Clara who changed. Kane himself became something he never thought he'd be again. Alive. He spoke more, even laughed. He started cooking better meals, remembering how his wife used to mix flour with a pinch of salt, just so. One day he even found himself sitting at the creek, carving a small wooden horse-knot for utility, but simply because Clara said she never had a toy as a child. That evening, when he handed it to her, she stared at it for a long time before, saying only 2 words, "It's mine." They were simple words, but to Clara, they meant everything. Nothing had ever truly been hers before, not food, not freedom, not even her name, some days, but that carved wooden horse marked a beginning. She kept it beside her bed like a treasure, touching it sometimes before sleep. as if reminding herself that this world she now lived in, this tiny slice of sky and grass and wood, was real, and she belonged in it. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Clara ran up to Cain while he was chopping wood. "I want to show you something," she said breathlessly. He followed her, curious, down past the pasture and along the small ridge overlooking the range. She knelt by a patch of earth where she'd planted something, wild sunflowers, now sprouting defiantly through the dust. Cain blinked. He hadn't even known she'd taken seeds from the sack in the shed. "I wanted something new to grow here," she said. "Something that says, I'm staying." Cain knelt beside her. The wind picked up then, soft and warm, rustling the tall grass and whispering through the trees. He looked at the girl, no, the daughter beside him. She wasn't shackled anymore. She wasn't silent. She wasn't afraid. She was home. "You are staying," he said softly. "You're my girl, now. Far as I'm concerned, you always were." Clara turned to him, and for the first time, tears filled her eyes, not from fear or sorrow, but from safety, from knowing that even if the past came back with teeth and fire, someone would stand in front of her with a rifle and a love that didn't flinch. Later that night, as they sat on the porch watching stars blink open across the black sky, Clara rested her head against Cain's arm. No words were spoken. They didn't need to be. The silence between them was no longer hollow, it was sacred, woven with understanding, trust, and a quiet vow that neither of them would ever be alone again. The land stretched endlessly before them, rugged and wide, but between that girl and that old man, something stronger had taken root, not just family, but redemption.